12 commercial ships captured in one coordinated sweep across 3 Arctic choke points, 40 Russian naval units active simultaneously across the Barents, Kara, and East Siberian theaters, and $3 billion in American and Allied commercial assets currently locked down in Russian custody. These are not hypothetical war game scenarios or the fever dreams of Cold War nostalgists, but the stark operational reality unfolding in the Arctic Circle as of early 2026, a crisis that has blindsided Western policymakers, shattered decades of post-Cold War assumptions about regional stability, and exposed the catastrophic strategic blind spot at the heart of NATO's northern flank. And to understand how we arrived at this inflection point, where Russian Federation naval forces have effectively seized control of critical maritime corridors, detained vessels flying the flags of the United States, Norway, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and weaponized the Arctic's legal ambiguities into a lever of coercion, we must first grasp the convergence of 3 forces that have been gathering momentum beneath the surface of international diplomacy for the better part of a decade. First, the accelerating retreat of Arctic sea ice, which has opened previously impassable shipping lanes and transformed the region from a frozen wilderness into a contested economic frontier worth trillions in untapped energy reserves, rare earth minerals, and shortened trade routes between Europe and Asia. Second, the systematic militarization of Russia's Arctic coastline, including the reopening of Soviet-era bases, the deployment of new icebreaker fleets, the installation of advanced radar and missile systems, and the creation of dedicated Arctic brigades trained for extreme cold warfare, all of which have been dismissed by Western analysts as expensive posturing rather than the foundation of a coherent territorial strategy. And third, the erosion of international legal frameworks governing Arctic sovereignty, particularly the ambiguities within the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea regarding extended continental shelf claims, exclusive economic zones, and the rights of coastal states to regulate traffic through newly navigable passages, ambiguities that Moscow has exploited with surgical precision to craft a legal pretext for what amounts to piracy, under a flag of environmental enforcement and maritime safety. And it is this third factor, the weaponization of legal gray zones, that explains the operational audacity of the recent seizures, because the 12 vessels currently detained in Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, and Tiksi were not intercepted in international waters during routine transit, but rather within Russia's newly declared Special Arctic Economic Zone, a unilateral maritime designation announced in late 2025 that extends Russian regulatory authority up to 500 nautical miles from its northern coastline, far beyond the 200-mile exclusive economic zone recognized under international law. And while Western governments immediately rejected this declaration as invalid, Russia has proceeded to enforce it with overwhelming force, dispatching not only surface combatants and submarines, but also long-range aviation, electronic warfare units, and even tactical ground forces to Arctic islands positioned along key shipping routes, effectively creating a layered defense-in-depth posture that can interdict any vessel attempting to transit the northern sea route without Russian approval. And the detained ships, a mix of liquefied natural gas tankers, container vessels, and research ships, were boarded by Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, maritime units under the pretext of environmental inspections, customs violations, and failure to obtain mandatory icebreaker escort permits, charges that are technically grounded in Russian domestic law, but entirely illegitimate under the international legal order. Yet the genius of Moscow's strategy lies not in the legality of the seizures, but in the calculated ambiguity of the response options available to the West. Because unlike a traditional act of war, an attack on a naval vessel, a violation of sovereign territory, or a direct assault on Allied forces. The detention of civilian commercial ships in disputed waters occupies a legal and military twilight zone that defies easy categorization, and this ambiguity has paralyzed the NATO alliance, with member states locked in internal debate over whether the seizures constitute an armed attack under Article 5, whether economic sanctions are sufficient, whether a naval task force should be dispatched to challenge Russian control, or whether quiet diplomacy offers the only path to de-escalation. And in the absence of a unified response, Russia has consolidated its gains, announcing that detained vessels will be released only after their operators pay substantial fines, acknowledge Russian sovereignty over the special Arctic Economic Zone, and agree to long-term transit agreements that grant Moscow de facto veto power over all future Arctic shipping, terms that amount to a protection racket on a geopolitical scale and represent the most brazen assertion of extraterritorial control since China's island-building campaign in the South China Sea. But the strategic stakes in the Arctic are far higher, because control of the Northern Sea route is not merely about regional dominance. It is about reshaping the global supply chain, and this is where the crisis transcends its immediate operational parameters and reveals its deeper significance as a harbinger of a new era in great power competition, because the Arctic shipping lanes represent the most valuable logistical prize of the 21st century, offering a route from East Asia to Europe that is 40% shorter than the Suez Canal passage, immune to choke point vulnerabilities in the Strait of Malacca or the Bab el-Mandeb, and capable of handling the supertankers and mega-container ships that define modern maritime commerce. And for decades, the dream of a navigable Arctic corridor was just that, a dream deferred by impenetrable ice and prohibitive costs. But climate change has rewritten the equation, with summer sea ice extent declining by roughly 13% per decade since the 1980s, and current projections suggest that the Northern Sea route will be ice-free for at least 4 months per year by 2030, transforming it from a marginal seasonal passage into a viable alternative to southern routes. And the economic implications are staggering. Every major shipping conglomerate, energy company, and industrial logistics network is recalculating its long-term infrastructure investments to account for Arctic access, and whoever controls the regulatory and security architecture of this new corridor will hold a stranglehold over trillions of dollars in annual trade, and Russia, with its 24,000-kilometer Arctic coastline and exclusive access to the entire northern littoral of Eurasia, has positioned itself as the gatekeeper. But the problem, and the reason the current crisis has escalated so rapidly, is that Russian control is not simply a matter of geography or infrastructure investment. It is a function of coercive power projection, and the seizures of the 12 vessels are not isolated incidents, but rather the opening salvo in a sustained campaign to force Western and Asian shipping companies into a binary choice: accept Russian terms and pay Moscow's tolls, or abandon the Arctic entirely and cede the future of polar commerce to a revisionist power willing to use military force to impose its will. And this ultimatum has profound implications not only for global trade, but for the broader architecture of international order. Because if Russia succeeds in unilaterally redefining the legal status of the Arctic and enforcing its claims through detention, coercion, and the threat of escalation, it will establish a precedent that other revisionist powers, most notably China, will rush to replicate in contested maritime zones around the world, from the South China Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean, and the West will have demonstrated that it lacks either the resolve or the capability to defend the principle of freedom of navigation when challenged by a nuclear-armed adversary willing to escalate. And this is the deeper meaning of the current crisis. It is not fundamentally about 12 ships or $3 billion in detained assets. It is about whether the rules-based international order can withstand a deliberate, systematic assault by a great power that has calculated, correctly so far, that the West is too divided, too risk-averse, and too strategically myopic to mount a coherent response. And George Will, in his recent commentary, has framed this crisis in precisely these terms, arguing that the Arctic seizures represent the logical culmination of a pattern of Western appeasement that began with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, continued through the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, the downing of MH17, the election interference campaigns, the cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a pattern in which Moscow tests the boundaries of acceptable behavior, absorbs the diplomatic condemnations and economic sanctions, and then moves forward to the next provocation, secure in the knowledge that the West will ultimately prioritize stability over principle, and the Arctic is simply the next frontier in this strategy of creeping revisionism, but with one critical difference. In the Arctic, Russia holds the geographic advantage, the legal ambiguity, and the military preponderance necessary to impose its will without triggering a direct NATO response. And unless the alliance can forge a unified strategy that combines legal countermeasures, economic leverage, military deterrence, and diplomatic isolation, the $3 billion in detained assets will be only the down payment on a much larger geopolitical debt, one that future generations will pay in the currency of diminished sovereignty, constrained commerce, and a world in which might makes right and the strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. And that, in the end, is the Arctic crisis that nobody predicted but everyone should have seen coming.